All right, my Psychians, it has been a long year, and I feel like a lot of you have been waiting for this moment. I know that when I took AP Psych, my love of abnormal was just right when I finally got to it. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so interesting. How can I not learn more? So I hope that you enjoy our lecture. And I remember it is 17% on the AP test, abnormal and treatment together. So take really quality good notes. Don't wait till last minute to be doing these notes. And let's get started. I also color coordinated. So when we get into the next video lecture, I color coordinate the different categories of mental health disorders. So you can also use color coordination to help. But first things first, let's go into introduction of psychology disorders. So to study the abnormal is the best way to study the normal. I don't know why. I love this quote. I take it with me every day. And if we were in class, I would ask, how many people do you think suffer with some type of mental health disability worldwide? The answer is 450 million people. And that is the people that are diagnosed. So this is very prevalent. It's not something that is rare. So let's get into it. And this is just a quick excerpt from your text, and it's just a little quick kind of a little quote to enter us in, and this is from Mark, who was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, and this is what he said, and you don't have to write this down, this is just an intro. I felt the need to clean my room and spent 4 to 5 hours at it. I would take every book out of the bookcase, dust, and put it back. At the time, I loved doing it. Then I didn't want to do it anymore, but I couldn't stop. The clothes in my closet hung exactly 2 fingers apart. I make a ritual of touching the wall in my bedroom before I went out because something bad would happen if I didn't do it right away. I had constant anxiety about it as a kid, and it makes me think for the first time that I might be nuts. So again, as we go through this, please have empathy as we learn about this, because a lot of people deal with these, these mental health issues, and let's talk about it. So real quick, going into psychological disorders, we don't write this down, just a quick stats, approximately 1 in 5 adults in the US for 43.8 million, or 18.5% experience mental health illness in a given year. And again, just know that this, again, it hits a lot more people. And many disorders like depression and schizophrenia actually exist in all cultures around the world, and they just are perceived differently. So let's start writing our notes. So psychological disorders. In order for something to be classified as a psychological disorder, it must have the 3 Ds, okay? The first one is deviant. Is it outside of the norm, right? Is it outside of the norm? Number 2, is it distressful? Does it cause you an immense amount of stress? And number 3, dysfunctional. Does it interfere with your everyday life, right? Of patterns, thoughts, feelings, and actions. So in order for it to be categorized as a psychological mental health disorder, it has to have the 3 Ds. It can be defined by culture and context, right? Different cultures and different contexts all around the world have various judgments when it comes to psychological disorders. So that's also, culture does play a part in all of this. And again, it can change over time, but what is considered a psychological disorder, it can change, but for the most part, as we learn more and more about the DSM-5, which is kind of our big book that has all the mental health disorders, it does adapt, right? It does adapt over time. And as we go through all of our lessons today, I will also comment the different newer versions of different categories of mental health issues. And then I want you to write down psychopathology. It is the new term for abnormal psych. So psychopathology is the scientific study of the origins, symptoms, and the development of psychological disorders. So psychopathology is the new term for abnormal psychology. So when I was at Sonoma State, I took the abnormal psychology class, but then the next year they named it psychopathology because it was the newer 21st century term that people kind of liked more than that whole abnormal aspect, right? So ancient treatments, what did people who had these, psychological disorders that we know of now, how were they treated in the past? For anyone who's read Cuckoo's Nest, my friends, same thing. So ancient treatments of psychological disorders included trepanation, which is where they would drill holes into your skull to release the demons. There is a very high correlation to what people believe is back in the middle 1900s. People believed that they were talking to the devil. They were demented. People believed that they were demons that were inside their brains, and they tried exorcism. They were caged like animals. They were beaten, burned, castrated, mutilated. Some people even tried to transfuse and to rechange all their blood out with animals' blood. Again, people were not treated fairly and nicely because they were different, right? And when we go over some of these psychological disorders, some of them need antipsychotics. People need to take medication in order to function, which the prime example would be schizophrenia, right? People who had schizophrenia were most commonly treated like this, right? And I also want you guys to think of the Book of Mice and Men with George and Lenny, right? And how Lenny was treated, right? So again, not treated well back in the day. Back in the day, my friends, they were not treated well. So when we think about the perspective of psychological disorder, we want to look at it through the biopsychosocial model, right? And for each of these, I want you to write down one bullet point per. So I do want you guys to copy down the psychological disorder, biopsychosocial. And I also want you guys to highlight the medical model. It is a vocabulary term, and the medical model holds, so this is the DSM-5, that psychological disorders have a physical cause that can be diagnosed, treated, and in most cases cured, often through hospital treatment. Cured is a very flexible term because some of these psychological disorders you can't get rid of them. You just learn to live with them and to function with them, right? Usually with medication. So when we talk about psychological disorders, before we really dive into it, there are some that are biologically driven that are passed through genetics. So again, schizophrenia and mood disorders like bipolar are known to be passed through the mom's side of genetics. The psychological influences, stress and trauma, my friends. When we learn about DID, dissociative identity disorder, it is your brain's defense mechanism to trauma. So some of these psychological disorders are genetic, which is nature-driven, but then there's a lot of these psychological disorders that are environmentally driven, right? So then there's the social cultural influences like roles, expectations, what's normal in your culture, what's not. I forget which culture it was, but people who were showing schizophrenic signs people would believe that they're shamans and that they were talking to their god and they were kind of a vessel for that. So again, throughout the years, there's been many theories, there's been many different cultural ideologies around, psychological disorders, so that definitely plays a role. And again, just talked about the biopsychosocial. So classifying the psychological disorders in the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is the current diagnostic tool for all psychopathological disorders. The purpose of having this kind of massive book, right, is to describe a disorder, predict its course, apply appropriate treatment, and stimulate research into the causes. So if you were to, and usually we're in class, I would show off my DSM-5. It's in my classroom. I don't have it with me, but that is how it's structured. Describes the disorder, predicts, implies appropriate treatment, and stimulate research into the cause. And it's called, the official term, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. And this allows, so pros and cons, and this is what we would usually do talking about a partner, right? So a pro of DSM-5, and write this in your notes, it allows people worldwide to get the same diagnosis, hopefully, right? So this manual is hopefully a way for everyone around the world, especially the US, so someone in New York that is diagnosed with OCD will also go to California and have the same diagnosis, right? So it's a way to have kind of a book to reference. But one of the really big cons is labeling people too early. And we'll talk about that, right? Think about stereotype threat. And also remember, in childhood, we change the most, and diagnosing early has some negative effects as well. So just real quick before we dive into each of our abnormal psychology topics, I first want us to really think back to the perspectives of clinical psychology within our lenses. So when we go into treatment of abnormal, this is how we look at things. So through the psychoanalytical perspective, they believe to understand the root of a disorder, we must look at a person's early life history. So traumas that are associated with dissociative identity disorder, which we'll talk about later, have a very high correlation of a sexual trauma early in life. So that's how the psychoanalytical looks at it. The behavioral, obviously, just like we say, they like to understand the disorder by analyzing the behavior that is learned. So with obsessive compulsive disorder, they would look at the behaviors of the compulsions, right? The cognitive perspective focuses on the roots within the thoughts and our beliefs. So when we, just like when we talked about eating disorders, it's a cognitive, illogical thought pattern that's within the brain, right? So that's under the cognitive lens. And then we have our humanistic lens and our sociocultural. So humanistic is where, believes that people are responsible for their own behavior. So pretty much we focus on this, this is very, this also is used within the anxiety disorders of kind of figuring out, it has to do with our self-worth, our confidence, our social setting, and then social cultural, right? Believes in abnormal behavior shaped by family, society, and culture. Again, that is how they view the lens of what maybe are some stressors that led to these behaviors, right? And no, we don't have to write this down, but real quick, this is a quick screenshot snapshot of what the DSM-5 criteria for ADHD looks like. It does say 4, but it is updated with 5. And it's, so for example, so this is when we're talking about people with ADHD, and I do want us to write down just this little top part, because ADHD is just, this is part of the example, but I wanted to teach about it. And people with ADHD, so again, right, show a persistent pattern of inattention and hyperactivity, impulsivity that interferes with the functioning or development. And so when we talk about inattention, it means 6 or more of the following symptoms that children have to show up to the age of 16. So remember, they're really, really big on clarifying when it's appropriate to diagnose, right? So, and when we talk about an overdiagnosing, ADHD is one of the main leading overly diagnosed psychological disorders, especially in children. So parents believe, that has a hard time paying attention, he must have ADHD, right? Let's get medication. It's one of those type of situations. And then we talk about hyperactivity, which is more so in males. So hyperactivity, again, I would just write just a quick few little note taking on hyperactivity. It's the actions. So males tend to have more of the hyper aspect, where women have more of the ADD aspect within the brain. And again, the DSM-5 labels what are some examples, right? So as people are getting diagnosed, we're going through and check marking which symptoms apply to those people, right? Or the people that we're looking at. So real quick, before, again, we dive into the most important aspects, right, each psychological disorder, here are some of the dangers of diagnosing. There are some dangers to diagnosing people, right? There is a label, so labels can be biased and perceptions and can change reality. So if I have been labeled as someone who is a schizophrenic, maybe I might just give up on the idea that I can have a normal life and try, right? Labels can be arbitrary and betray value judgment. Labels can serve for a self-fulfilling prophecy. So people who believe that, okay, I have ADHD, let me show people how much I got it, right? And then they actually become more hyper because they're trying to live up to what their prophecy says about them. And labels can stigmatize, right? And it can add to stereotypes around that disorder, especially with mental health. And, we'll talk about kind of the stereotypes that Hollywood puts on these mental health. Like, for example, DID with the movie Split, right? They fed off the stereotype that people with identity disorder, dissociative identity disorders, are aggressive. In reality, they are not. It's very low amount to be aggressive, right? So again, we'll go through that. And just a few of the labeling for psychological disorders. The critics of the DSM-5 argue that labels can stigmatize, right? So just like we talked about insanity labels. Oh, when people plead insanity, that is some interesting stuff, my friends. We'll talk about that later in class. But, labels rise with moral and ethical questions about how society should treat people who have disorders and who committed the crime, right? So when we plead insanity for we're gonna listen to some case studies, my friends, where insanity, my friends, insanity. Labels can be helpful for healthcare professionals, right? So all in all, it can be very helpful, but also there is also the cons to labeling. And just understanding the categories. These are the categories that we will be going over. We have already gone over the eating disorders in our previous chapter, so I won't focus too much on those. But these are the topics that we will be going over in our modules. And you don't have to write this down, but last but not least, just approximations within, survey respondents. Anxiety disorders tend to be a heavily, I don't want to say popular, but very, very common, along with depression. And this is just a few stats, right? These are just a few stats. All right, that's it for this first little intro. Let's get started with our anxiety disorders next.